All right, Erev Tov again, everybody. Parashat Vayigash, two essays, short-ish essays of Rabbanit Dr. Michal Tikashinsky. And we're going to end um, Bereshit 1 week early. I'll be away next week, so this will be our premature conclusion to the book of Bereshit, but I will send a couple of essays um, from Vayechi for your reading pleasure beginning of next week. We're going to try to get through both of these from Vayigash. The first one, very typical and takes sort of delves into one idea from the parasha, kind of through a broader lens. What is this concept of the type of Yosef's leadership around the economic management of the famine and the Egyptians, and kind of that approach of looking at one issue in depth, not necessarily by relating to a lot of other sources, but just sort of taking a broader lens on the idea and then bringing it up to the modern day. And then the second one will give a little bit more of a kind of journey through the approaches of the commentaries to one moment in the parasha. So here we go. Okay, Yosef's economic policy or sort of business approach. Yosef's leadership or management technique as the Sar HaOtzar, the Minister of the Treasury, Secretary of the Treasury, so to speak, of Egypt, is not based on humanistic or ethical values. Eina mevusesat al arachim humaniyim umusariyim. Okay, it starts off with a very direct kind of critique or description of the way Yosef runs Egyptian business. Yosef buys up all the property of the Egyptian citizens in this time of famine in exchange for bread, right? He gives them provisions and he buys up all of their possessions. He gives them the right to live in exchange for their economic freedom. In the end of the process, all the citizens of Egypt are left lacking everything, with nothing, and completely dependent on the decisions, on the almost whims of the kingdom, the kingship, the royal wish. After all their fields have been collected as a result of their debts, then they are transferred into the cities, and they no longer even dwell on their own property, on their own territorial holdings. This is just a kind of summary and description of what happens at the end of the parasha over time as the famine gets worse. And Yosef, again, in order to give bread, he first takes their possessions and then collects their land and moves them into the cities. Just prose paraphrasing of the end of the parasha. And at the end of the matter, the ultimate conclusion is that Yosef suggests to the Egyptian citizens that they work the king's land, and a fifth of the produce will be handed over to the royal treasury, and with the rest they can sustain themselves as sharecroppers on land which they have no ownership privileges over. Vihine, and behold, my dad and I were talking about how to translate this term sometimes. Indeed, or in light of this, I don't know, not an easy word to translate, but vihine, the commentaries specifically emphasize the maybe it's almost a contrasting term here, we could say, and yet, or and surprisingly, upon closer look, the commentaries specifically emphasize the ethical and the rational dimensions in this arrangement that Yosef suggests, right? Her having said in a kind of a objective, descriptive way, there's nothing humanistic or ethical driving Yosef's economic approach. He strips the Egyptians of all of their rights um, in exchange for the food that he provides them with. So having said that, it's interesting to see that the commentaries still seem to capitalize on or look for ethical, rational dimensions to his arrangement. According to the Midrash, Yosef um, could acquire all of the land for his own personal needs, and yet he restrains himself from doing that. Midrash Sechel Tov says, "Af al pichein lo kana otam letzolko ki'im lefaro." Right? Yosef, in spite of this, meaning this seeming to mean his right to do so, in spite of this, Yosef doesn't purchase or take hold of all of these fields for his own needs, but rather for Paro, right? So there's some way in which he's not totally self-motivated, even though he would be entitled to be, according to the Midrash. Instead, he's focused on what's good for the king, the kingdom, or at least the king, and not himself. Ramban emphasizes, that's a comment of the Midrash, Ramban emphasizes that Yosef also never kind of bought the citizens themselves, the residents of Egypt themselves, to be slaves, but allowed them to remain as free people. Again, not like super impressive on the grand scheme of things, but what she wants to point out is that when you look at it through the lens of the commentaries, they're highlighting things he was by right entitled to do or were within his authority, and yet he didn't do. So the Ramban emphasizes that Yosef, allowed them to retain their freedom, even though that's not something that's not self-evident. The emphasis of the Ramban, it's hard to actually find unequivocal support for this in the psukim. Okay, so with it already being against the grain that the commentaries are looking to highlight the positive within Yosef's behavior, not only that, but their point, or the Ramban's point here, is not even an obviously clearly defensible one. Right? Yes, it's the case on the one hand that it says, Vayiken Yosef et kol admat Mitzrayim. Yosef purchased all of the land of Egypt. And it doesn't say there that he purchased the people as slaves. But in a subsequent pasuk, it emphasizes that Yosef claims, Hein kaniti etchem hayom vet admadchem leparo. I acquired you and your land for Paro. So from that verse, it sounds like he really did buy the people, buy ownership or control over the people in exchange for giving them food provisions. The Ramban further adds that the arrangement of division of produce was actually quite generous. Nadiv bioter. Yosef could have given the workers 1/5 and taken for the king much higher amounts, right? The fact that he actually took only 20% for the royal treasury and left the rest for the people themselves was generous on Yosef's behalf. Pardon me 1 minute, just step into the kids' room and be right back. Sorry for the delay. Everybody's fine. Um, okay, so okay, we said Yosef could have divided up the apportioned the produce differently and taken more for the royal treasury and given less to the citizens themselves, but he gave them, the lion's share of the produce that they were working and harvesting and producing. But here too, it's not clear what the level of expenses of the workers were, what the amount or level of their profit was, and therefore it's hard to know how generous Yosef's proposed arrangement actually was, or we don't know enough about the economic reality to know whether having them go home with 80% was generous or appropriate for the amount of work and the amount of expenditure that they were putting in. One way or another, there's certainly no equivalence, equality between the two sides when it comes to this business arrangement, and there is no one to protect the workers' rights. These workers who were forced against their will to enter into this given, deal, in order to just preserve their this deal, which involves taking advantage of their needy and sort of disadvantaged state. So right, no matter how we think about Yosef did better than he could have, he was more generous than he by rights needed to be. There's no question that this is an unequal. There's a great power imbalance here, and any focus on the protecting the rights of the workers, the Egyptians, does not seem to enter into the calculus here. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch even adds another point of light in Yosef's behavior. According to him, the coerced fleeing migration away from the fields and the rural regions into the cities had a dimension of chesed to it, because when Yosef did it, he cleared out whole social groups in accordance with their kind of grouping to the cities. Meaning, and this is actually, as always, the contemporary realities, color our reading. And this was very much the case post October 7th, that as much as possible, the whole kibbutzim and the whole, small cities or towns were resettled all as one into the different locations that they went to. So Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says this is how Yosef did the resettling of the Egyptians, making sure that they moved as entire social groups. At the very least, says Yosef worried that the social community context would be preserved. In so doing, he kind of avoided a much greater disaster, and prevented all kinds of problematic things that arise in refugee groups, basically. So again, just fascinating what she's pointing out here, which is this attempt to read positively into Yosef's behavior, that if you just look at it from a plain economics and power structure analysis, seems not immoral necessarily, but not motivated by moral concerns, but by pure economic and power centralization concerns. This repetitive attempt of the commentaries and the midrashim to point to these points of light in Yosef's actions and in the ways of his kind of behavior sharpen the difficulty which is in it, right? I think we've certainly seen that, like the fact that these are forced and not easy readings into the text highlight how difficult it is to attempt to point up the good in what otherwise doesn't seem to be very good. The arrangement which Yosef suggests is a very difficult arrangement, one which is kind of pushed on to the Egyptians at the hands of the ruler who is otherwise supposed to be concerned for their security and their welfare. He puts into the hands of the one who foresaw this disaster, and yet in place of enabling the citizens to save and store up for themselves, and even if that would have involved, coercion as a solution and an answer to that disaster, instead, he worries instead about filling up the coffers of the country, through his aid, right? Just pointing out, could have been some kind of compulsory storing project where every person was required to put away some percentage of their, produce in the years of plenty for themselves. But instead, Yosef, who, because of his interpretive powers of Paro's dreams, knows what's coming, chooses an approach which centers the state's wealth as opposed to the citizens' well-being. We're talking here about an arrangement which ultimately harms every fundamental right that we recognize today: the rights of ownership, the rights to life with dignity, the rights to freedom, and so forth. The question whether Yosef took or didn't take profit into his own pocket is a peripheral, a marginal question, right? Coming back to that point of the Midrash. Well, Yosef could have taken for himself, but he didn't. He, took it all for Paro. This is her critique of that Midrash, saying that's incidental. That's you're focusing on the wrong spot. The spot should be, did Yosef take care of the Egyptians or did he not take care of the Egyptians? Not did he funnel things into his own pocket or keep it all for Paro. What would have been expected would have been to worry about the welfare of the Egyptians. It's clear to everyone that Yosef, and even, right, even let's say he didn't take anything for himself from the proceeds of all this sale. It's clear to everyone, and this is, I'm not sure this is an obvious reading in the Midrash. That's, I mean, in the Psukim themselves, but this is her claim. It's clear to everyone that Yosef lived, an expansive and wealthy life. Even if he didn't take a cut from the produce, for sure he had an exceedingly high salary, much higher than market rate, and he earned it. Because he was the one who made the country rich and saved its citizens from famine, from hunger. But it's still hard to ignore the fact that the only group that kind of benefited from all of this arrangement was Yosef's immediate family. They got a portion of land that was, very, very praised. That's not the best way, high quality. And they continue to, make their livelihood on the back of the entire country, right? So now she's pivoted a little bit to say, okay, we have the reading of the commentaries, which looks at Yosef, what he did to the Egyptians, and says, actually, it wasn't so bad. Look at these positive dimensions. And she says, how could that, how can you focus on that? There's so much fundamentally wrong with it. And now she shifts to a different piece and says, forget whether Yosef took anything for himself. Look at what he did for his family at the expense of everybody else. And she's going to delve into this just a little bit more as kind of the part B. The Josephian rulership is a totalitarian rulership and does not constitute a model for any kind of leadership. Together with this, the approach of these various commentaries as they're presented here illuminates an important corner area of consideration. The boundary, the dividing line between corruption in leadership and kind of appropriate conduct is actually a very fine line. Every power that a ruler has is accompanied with the the power. Sorry, I can't. Hard to differ. Every ability that a ruler has, everything at a ruler's disposal, is accompanied with the strength or force that comes with the possibility of benefiting others, and in so doing, to kind of get, this is really hard thing to translate, tovat hana'ah, like this and others. Tovat hana'ah is sort of like the goodwill that's generated, but it has a commercial capital value. The goodwill that's generated by having power to give to others. And that's what she's going to delve into now a little bit. The topic of tovot hana'ah, again, the benefit that comes from being able to do good for others, is something which, is dealt with in a whole variety of ways, not just in, the economics in this parasha, but also in the world of Talmud Torah of the sages, right? In the legal and learning world of the sages, the idea of this commodity of the benefits that come from being able to give things to people is a real concept in rabbinic literature. Every position of authority and power, in the end, has some economic, financial expression to it. A Yisrael, now this is kind of her move we see from her sometimes. It's going to take us into the world of the seemingly tangential world of other halachic details. A Yisrael, meaning a non-Kohen, an Israelite, has no authority, no rights to the truma, that portion that's given to the Kohen from amongst his produce. Rather, he's obligated to give it to the Kohen. But he does have the right to choose who will be the Kohen that gets that truma. And as such, the Israelite actually accrues a certain kind of power and a certain kind of authority, and kind of converts the Kohanim to people who wind up needing to fight and compete with each other about who's going to get the truma, right? It's a dimension we don't normally think about. Think about what it says in the Torah and in Halakha. You have to take 2% of your produce and give it to the Kohen. So that we, on the one hand, we think about that as that's like we don't own that. We have no claim over that. That belongs to the Kohanim. But in Halakha, we recognize that we have the choice about which Kohen to give it to, and as such, the Kohanim are kind of subject to the wish of the Israel in how they distribute. Okay, this power can be exploited and translated even into actual money. How so? Rashi explains that a Yisrael can say to another Yisrael, here, you take this salah, this little amount of money, and give all of your truma to my grandson, who is a Kohen, right? So you could pay someone to exercise a particular choice about who to give the truma to. Okay, that's Rashi in the Gemara and Pesachim. If so, Israel then can take advantage of the truma being in his pocket in order to, make him wealthier, even though we're not even talking about his own money, but money which through his means gets to its destination, right? So you've got your truma, you don't own it. It belongs to the Kohen, but because you are endowed with the right to decide where it goes, then it has a commodity value because someone might want to pay you something for the choice about where it gets given. This approach kind of can be conceptualized, and applied even beyond the dimension of Rashi's suggestion. A a Yisrael can himself kind of plot to get paid for receiving the truma. This advantage that the Yisrael has, or for about who receives the truma, this advantage that the Yisrael has is his right, and is what's defined in halacha as tovat hana'ah, as this benefit that comes from the good, almost in the sense of an economic good, right? A goods, the benefit of the goods that he has in his truma. In another place, it's described that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who was rich, supported from his pocket only Talmidei Chachamim in the years of famine, when it was, when it was time where there was not a lot of food. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi had wealth, and he used his discretionary funds, so to speak, only to support sages. He preferred the elite over the common person. Together with this, all these different sugyot, all these different little Talmudic passages are all talking about the tovat hana'ah that a person has with his money, but not the money of the public. This, as it appears, also serves as the justification for Yosef's behavior. Mitzrayim functions as a monarchy. The approach, the understanding that the land belongs to the king is a legitimate understanding in the context of that time and place. In a situation like this, and given these cultural conditions in which the rulers function in such a way as though the pocket, the profit of the country is really their pocket, their profit, Yosef behaved in a relatively proper manner. Okay, so when you accept that frame, this is kind of just a standard move, but here she's taking all those pieces of the various commentaries, that seemed to give Yosef credit for things maybe that weren't so deserved or even so obvious. When you put them in the cultural context, maybe they make a little bit more sense, which is this is really Yosef is an agent for the private property, so to speak, of the king. And therefore he has rights to decide where it goes, to whom it goes. And so this was proper or fair behavior, even if not the most moral behavior. And still, the appropriate longing is for a different kind of mechanism of rulership, rather for the condition or the reality that Moshe talks about when he's getting ready to separate from Bnei Yisrael, meaning as he is not far from his death, when he says, I never took a single donkey of theirs, and I never harmed any one of them, right? So she just ends with this little turn. She ends with this little turn to kind of, okay, even spending time attempting to justify and defend Yosef's behavior in its context, this is still not the ideal model, and the much preferred model is the model of Moshe, of never interfering with or staking any claim to the private property of the individuals under your rulership or care. Now, again, obviously, Moshe doesn't in any way have the same kind of state control that Yosef does, but the ethic that he displays is the one which is desired. Okay, so that's number one. Happy to pause for questions or comments. It's just a little bit of a deeper dive into Yosef's economic plan, the interesting insight in the way in which the commentaries try to see the good within it, and her kind of unstinting, not rejection of that, but insistence that, indeed, it's not based on a concern for the rights of the Egyptian citizens at all. Then the apologetic / explanation, that if you look at it in its cultural context, and you recognize the notion of kind of the rights of an owner to decide what to do with their property as a, a real commodity. That's sort of what Yosef was employing, because Egyptian property was not actually public, but it was the private property of the king that Yosef was empowered to oversee. And then ending again with the turn back towards the ultimate goal, which is a hands-off approach like Moshe's. Great. Lance, before we see second one, go ahead.
My understanding is that Joseph ruled Egypt for 80 years. How many details do we have during those 80 years?
Very little.
Very little. And the question becomes, where do these details we've just been discussing come from? Now, the position you've just heard is called the antipathy of Joseph. It's a scholarly position far beyond Rabbanit Tukhachevsky, and there's a great deal of debate about how to interpret this. My own inclination would be to ask the question, where in this little description is God? Where is the reference to God? Is there one?
Not in what we read.
Right. But in many of the other situations, it's always God enabled me to do this. This is because of God, 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 God. And it seems to me that it's likely, first of all, I have a totally different perspective on this because I think this is Assyrians and Samaritans and has nothing to do with Hebrews. But if from a strictly Hebrew perspective, it seems to me that, first of all, what Rabbanit Tukhachevsky is doing is a left-wing political analysis, and clearly the totalitarian regime that she criticizes is all over the ancient world. In fact, the idea of Sammy Davis Jr. going to visit Archie Bunker is ludicrous. Could never happen. Not in ancient times. The idea that a rabbi can emerge from a coffin and meet with Vespasian is complete and total nonsense. If you assume that the scholars that I've read of ancient civilizations are right, they might not be. Eric Auerbach in Mimesis says that this whole sympathy for the slaves and the other people is a Christian thing. It comes in the New Testament.
Great.
And, that's just my little take on this. It's highly debatable. Highly.
Totally agree. I see Steve. Hang on one second. And that's an interesting notion, kind of how have attitudes, and readings of Joseph shifted over time. Steve, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. I just wanted to compare the situation with Joseph and his treatment to the Egyptians to American history and our treatment to the slaves following emancipation. The slaves were free, but they became shareholders to the people who owned the land. After deducting for the equipment, supplies, purchases from the company store, they were left with very little after a week's work. And I contrast that with the Torah's later treatment of the importance of paying workers immediately or before night falls for the work that they've done.
Great intertexts, and maybe we see a development of how slaves or citizens, obviously different, but should be treated. I think those are great additional texts to bring into the conversation. All right, 907. Let's dive right into our second one. It really takes us in a different direction. Still connected to the kind of economic backdrop, and a little bit more kind of textual in nature, not in the sense of just looking at a few scattered psukim and building from that, but kind of closer look into one particular moment. And begins with a great contemporary cultural reference. So the title here is To Awaken from the Dream. And she writes, the movie Hatchala, translated as Inception, the movie Inception of Christopher Nolan deals with the question of the transition from dream to reality. And it sort of shakes or weakens maybe the sharply defined borders between these two things. We had a reference from her a week or two ago about the I think she said the Chinese proverb or Chinese saying or parable about someone who, dreamt they were a butterfly and then they woke up and then they couldn't decide if they had woken up from the dream or they had become a butterfly and now they were dreaming they were a person. So we have here another, obviously, dreams are a theme here. So in this latter part of Breshit. So that movie, Inception, deals with the transition from dream to reality and weakens the sharply defined borders between them. In this movie, there's also a kind of reminder of an experience which happens sometimes when a person who's dreaming becomes aware in the course of the dream of the fact that they're dreaming. In a situation like this, the hardest thing is to actually try and awaken oneself from that state. The fear of becoming stuck in the dream becomes greater and greater. When Yosef makes himself known to his brothers, he asks them to come down to Egypt with the claim or statement, it's been 2 years of famine in the midst of the land or across the land, and there will be 5 more years in which there will be no plowing and harvest. In these words, Yosef reveals to his brothers this, secret information that he has as a Egyptian elder, so to speak, or higher up, information which led to the enriching of Egypt and the impressive development of its economy. Of course, it also this kind of revelation also includes or is in another sense a wink, kritza, a wink to the brothers who had thought up until now that Yosef dreamed vain dreams. But now, when it becomes clear to them that his dreams have come true in their fullest, it will be easier for them to, cast their eyes down and accept that Yosef knows, what's going to happen in the future, right? At this point, that they've seen all his dreams come true, he's telling them there's going to be 5 more years of famine. They have reason to believe him that he has a good vision of what's going to happen in the future. And then in fact, or again, here's another hine, precisely at this pinnacle moment for Yosef, at the moment when he is drunk on the victory of the Amarti Lachem, the I told you so, which is a really beautiful movement back and forth between poetic Hebrew and kind of contemporary, even really English idiom that's being translated here. I haven't heard that much modern Israeli Amarti Lachem, but certainly based on the English. So at the moment at which he's at the drunk over the I told you so victory, a shadow of a doubt becomes cast over his knowledge of the future when the promised famine doesn't quite come to pass as expected, as we'll see. The Egyptians are paying with all their money, for the provisions of food. When their cash runs out from their pockets, and then they transfer to Yosef and Paro's house all of their property, their cattle, their flocks, and at the end, when they're left naked, vulnerable, and lacking everything, they come to Yosef and they say, let us not hold back from our master, even if the money and our flocks and our animals have been used up and given to our master. There's nothing left from, before our master except our very bodies and our land. And why should we die, in front of you? So they obviously, say, we've got nothing left, and what are we going to do now? And after Yosef then buys their land, the Torah says, probably should be a vav in there, Shehu noten lemitzrim, that he then gives the Egyptians seeds to plant in exchange for a fifth of the produce that will be brought to Paro's house. And we have the pasuk, here is seed, hey lachem zera, here is seed, uzratem et adama, plant the earth, sow the earth. And when the produce comes forth, you should give a fifth of it to Paro, and the other 4 parts of the hand, right? If yadot is the measure here, 4/5, the other 4/5 for a hand with 5 fingers will remain yours. So then it seems that it's clear that from this moment, which was at the start of the second year, which began at the end of the second year, the Egyptians start planting and harvesting and even paying these high taxes to the royal treasury. No famine. Indeed, plowing and harvesting carry on in their normal way. If so, specifically at the moment that Yosef is kind of lording himself, literally mit rav rev, rav, lording himself over his knowledge of the future, his dream actually becomes, abolished. And life goes back to its normal order, its normal cycle. The commentaries wonder how it could happen that the famine would stop at this early phase, and in opposition to the dream. And their answers include 2 possible streams, afikim. One, a kind of correction of the calculation, and a suggestion to explain the meaning of the second year as the second year after selling all of the livestock and collecting up all the gold and silver of Egypt, which was really the 7th year of the famine. So approach number 1 is to reinterpret when it says, do we have that pasuk earlier? Right, it's been 2 years of famine, or after the second year, that wasn't the second year from the beginning of the famine, but that was the second year from the point at which all Egyptian property had been claimed, which was year 5. And so the second year after that takes us to year 7, to the completion of the entire 7 years of famine. So one is a not super literal, rereading and recalculation of the math against the plain sense of the text in order to have the dream actually be not contradicted and have there be 7 years of famine. Hashniah, the second, is to condition or kind of hang the cancellation of the dream on Yaakov's arrival to Egypt. Okay, we'll see how that works in a few moments. An example of the first type of interpretation is in the Midrash, the Psikta Zutarta, which says, and there will be 5 more years in which there is no plowing and harvest, right? The quote from what Yosef says to his brothers, it's been 2 years of famine, now come down, because there's going to be 5 more years without plowing or harvest. So then how could it be that they planted in the 3rd year, asks the Midrash. Rather, when the verse says that ultimately they came to Yosef in that 2nd year, second to the selling of their property, which was the 7th, the end of the years of famine, right? So just an example of what she already spelled out above. Even the Ramban chooses this approach, right, to reinterpret the end of the 2nd year to actually say that it's the end of the 2nd year from the 5th year, making it the 7th year. And his reason, his motivation for this, he makes clear, which is that it can't be that Yosef's, predictive powers could be compromised, right? As the Ramban says, because if this were the case, if we had took it at literally that they came down in the 2nd year means the 2nd year, the end of the 2nd year of the famine, and then it ends, If that would be the case, then Yosef's words would not have come true according to their interpretation. And this would lead to suspicion of him and his wisdom, knowledge, authority. So the Ramban, based on that, says that it's not a possible interpretation. It would never, the story could not have unfolded the way it did with Yosef remaining in power if it were actually the case that his interpretations of the dreams turned out to be false. An example of the second kind of interpretation we find in the Tosefta. Tosefta and Sota says, until Yaakov went down to Egypt, there was famine, as it says, right? That Yosef said to his brothers, it is 2 years of famine. When he came down, what does it say? Here are seeds, and sow the earth, right? So clearly the Midrash there, the Tosefta there, is interpreting midrashically that when Yaakov came down, the famine ended. The underlying assumptions of these two explanations differ fundamentally, differ entirely. According to the first explanation, a divine decree is not subject to change, and also Yosef's sort of certainty, his inviolable authority and rule, are built up, sturdily in these parshiot, and there's no room to doubt his success. Right, that's kind of the fundamental assumption here. The vision of Yosef's rise to power, his authority, his capability, etc., is just not subject to any kind of question. The assumption, the grounding assumption of the second approach, is that there is dynamism, and every decree, every kind of plan is right for its moment, but not necessarily eternally valid. It's possible to wrestle with the decree in Josephian methods, store up food, preserve, animal feed, but it's also possible to wrestle with the decree and with natural disasters, which happen through another method. It's possible to actually prevent their actualization. A person has the power to rule over the laws of nature if only he can achieve a certain closeness to God, right? That's, again, we can ask, what does that mean? How is that possible? She's just saying that's what underlies the interpretation of the Midrash, is that if it's really the case that when Yaakov came down, the famine stopped, that's the kind of linchpin moment, then we have to understand that somehow human beings can change the order of nature, can change the reality. A third possibility that we can suggest right now here, she's not quoting any midrashic or otherwise source, but she wants to introduce another possibility. Again, we've seen this from her sometimes, kind of build up two approaches and then offer her own additional one. So a third possibility which we can suggest is that Yosef is hinting to the brothers that if they don't come down to Egypt, then there will not be any kind of plowing and harvest. But if they do come, then the data changes, everything shifts, and the anticipated kind of consequences of things going as they have been going could become surprising, can change, right? So that actually in Yosef's, right, she's reading this not as reinterpret the numbers so that it works out, because it can't be that Yosef's vision is and God's decree is subject to change. That was approach number one. Approach number two is, there are people who have the power to kind of supersede nature if they're close enough to God. That's Yaakov's sort of mystical power. And she's suggesting sort of the third approach is that Yosef is actually saying to his brothers, we don't have to assume that the world goes as it's going to go. If we take action, if we, if we change the reality, then the reality can change. We change the course of things, take an unexpected move, then things can play out differently, right? If the brothers will come down, then everything will change. The kind of the forces, the dynamics shift. This is also the reason that Yosef listens, kind of yields to the people of Egypt, and agrees to invest in planting and in plowing, because right, Yosef, the reason would dictate that Yosef would have had to tell them not to invest all this superfluous effort if he understood that all of this was in vain, right? So Yosef already giving them, one possibility is to say, well, already we started to see that the land was becoming fertile again. The other possibility is somehow that Yosef said, here, let's try something different and see what happens. He had this belief that there had to be another way. And maybe beyond this, even beyond this, Yosef understood in those moments that he was attempting to persuade his brothers to come down to Egypt, that the dream of Paro was actually his own dream. Here's where this goes back to this original idea that she was, quoting from Inception about sort of dreams inside dreams and the shifting kind of borders between dreams and reality, right? That actually the dreams were sort of converging, blending into one. That there was a divine plan which links between the dreams. And that plan was, and here again, we've seen this sort of nationalistic turn, and almost fate-driven turn at the end of some of her essays. Right, there was a divine plan which linked the two dreams, and that is that Am Yisrael needs to come down to Egypt. The plenty and the famine are just sort of the excuse. They're the dream within the dream. If Yaakov and his sons come down to Egypt, then the reason for the kind of actualization of the years of famine will no longer be needed. And it will be possible to wake up from the dream of Paro into the dream of Yosef, right? So if really what was driving all of this was kind of Yosef's dream, that his family will kind of come down to him. So the famine was the driver for that. And once that comes to pass, then the kind of that dream of the years of plenty and years of famine is subsumed into Yosef's dream, and it sort of dissipates. It's possible to wake up from the dream of Paro into the dream of Yosef. These dreams don't, demand us to get sort of stuck in them. It's possible to awaken from them into a more complex, multifaceted reality. So a little trippy at the end. But here I think we got a chance for a little more of a classical look into one textual point, which is this conflict that on the one hand we have the expectation that the dream, of the dreams being fulfilled, and kind of so much built on that, that there's supposed to be 7 years of famine which follow the 7 years of plenty, and yet the brothers come down at the end of the second year, and at that point Yosef is giving out seed to sow the earth. Clearly, it seems to indicate that the famine is over, that planting is possible. And so we have the kind of two approaches, one to recalculate the end of 2 to actually be the end of 2 after the 5. And so it really is the full 7, and the whole famine, does, and the dreams are fulfilled in their standard meaning. Second is that somehow, there are people who have the power to override history. That's Yaakov somehow. And the third is this sort of idea of cause and effect interplay, and the idea that there are these different spheres of dreams that are intersecting and that are really about bringing Yaakov's family down to Egypt. And once that happens, that Paro's dream gives way to Yosef's dream. Lance, go for it.
Oh, I put in the chat a link to an essay which is about the antipathy to Joseph. It's a parallel essay to the essay by Rabbi Tukachinsky. And I thought you might find that interesting. It's pretty long and complicated. But you can click on the link, click on the blue and go to it, or you can just use the link by itself and put it into your browser, whichever you like.
Great.
I could be wrong, but my recollection of inception is that inception is a technique by which we get somebody to do something, manipulating their unconscious. But I could be wrong about that.
Right. Yeah, I don't know how technical she was using the term, just talking about the movie, but yes, and it's interesting. I also Googled a drop and see that the Torah.com has an article called "Is the recent antipathy to Joseph justified?" So I wasn't aware of this sort of ongoing debate and discussion, and I look forward to looking into it some more. So thank you. That's great. Other questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you to everybody for exploring Rabbanit Dr. Michal Tukachinsky. I think really, I mean, everybody that we learn is a little different. I found, the pieces were short on the shorter side, so sometimes we got to do two. And the approach of kind of taking, especially works well for Breshit. I haven't read her on the other Chumashim, but kind of especially because this is the beginning. So many concepts and ideas are kind of being founded, or they're foundational appearance comes in Breshit. So this sort of approach of taking an idea, a concept, an action, a phenomenon that appears in the Parashah, trying to gently stretch it out a little bit across the Chumash or across the Tanakh with other examples, say something about it more broadly, is one of the approaches and themes we've seen from her. Definitely no shortage of texts, but I think a little bit more of kind of just her own descriptive style and poetic style. As always, exposure, as I think we've seen with almost everybody that we've studied, they introduce us to midrashim and comments that we wouldn't necessarily see. I mean, her breadth is very impressive. Just to quote a midrash and a Ramban and a Rav Hirsch and a Tosefta side by side, just gives you a great glimpse into things. And she classifies them as part of greater schools, for example, so we know she's reading a lot more than just the examples that she's provided for us. A little bit of little philosophy, a little sociology, a little pop culture along the way. So thanks for dabbling. This is really my first time studying her essays, and it was great to do it with everybody. We're going to be going on to, so we're off next week, but I'll send a couple of essays for you to read, and then 2 weeks we'll be back with Sefer Shemot and back with Rabbi Shai Held, who we did on Vayikra last year. We're going to be doing on Shemot this year. Dad?
First, it's good to be on the video. I wonder, does Joseph know about that revelation that Abraham had about, they're going to go down to, they're going to be in a land not their own, and they're going to be enslaved in 400 years or whatever. Is that why he's so insistent in bringing his father and brothers into Egypt? Does he know that already?
Right. Yeah. I can't think of any place in the Chumash itself where it makes explicit to us that that is known. I do think that some of the commentaries assume it, but it's certainly a fascinating question. I mean, do we know for sure? We don't know that Abraham transmits it to anybody.
Yeah.
So, it's a really fascinating question. And thank you to Ruchi for your comment also. Yep. Interesting in light of mass famine-related migrations. Indeed. Yep. All right. Yasher koach, everybody. Thank you. Thanks for a great Breshit. Looking forward to going on to Shemot together. Good night to all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining. Bye.